My coworker made our lives miserable for a year, so when a customer falsely accused her, I refused to defend her and she got fired. I have been a cashier for a large grocery store chain in the United States for more years than I care to count. My colleagues have always described me as reliable, steady, and maybe a little guarded, but I'd been with the company for so long that people knew I would show up on time, do my job well, and help out whenever I could. Our location was busy enough to keep a steady flow of customers, but small enough for me to recognize many familiar faces each day. Normally, the biggest nuisances in my work life were the occasional rude customer, a glitchy register, or the manager who insisted we push loyalty cards on everyone who walked through the door. But all of that changed about a year ago when Shannon arrived. She was in her early 20s, newly transferred from some other store. No one seemed to know exactly where she came from, but there were rumors. One rumor said she'd come from a large, high-pressure city store where the staff was cutthroat and no one had patience for small talk. Another rumor said she was actually from a much smaller store in a remote region, and that she hadn't adjusted well to the busier environment here. None of us knew for sure, because Shannon never volunteered any details about her life or her background. In fact, one of her defining traits was how she rarely, if ever, engaged in casual conversation unless it was to complain or criticize. From the moment she stepped onto the front end as a customer service specialist, she seemed to carry herself with the kind of authority typically reserved for managers, even though she wasn't actually in management. I remember the day she first arrived. We were short-staffed, and I had been juggling more than my fair share of impatient customers when I glanced over and saw a new face near the office door. She had a posture that was rigid, almost offensive, and she observed everything with a critical gaze that made me uneasy. I tried to wave hello, my standard polite gesture, but she gave me the briefest nod and quickly looked away, as if making eye contact was something to be avoided at all costs. At the time, I figured she was just nervous or shy. Being transferred to a new store can be rough, especially if you don't know anyone. I'd seen plenty of new hires go through that awkward adjustment period, but as the weeks passed, it became clear that Shannon's demeanor wasn't merely shyness. She wore an expression of thinly veiled contempt most of the time. If I was scanning a line of customers, I'd occasionally catch her standing several feet behind my register, arms crossed, glaring as if she expected me to slip up at any moment. If I made even the smallest error, like forgetting to ask a customer if they wanted their meat bagged separately, Shannon would sigh loudly, roll her eyes, and mutter something about people not following simple rules. It didn't matter if I had a legitimate reason for what I did. She seemed determined to find fault in whatever I or anyone else did. The store's front-end staff was mostly older folks like me. There was Nancy, a grandmother in her 60s who had been with the company for nearly 35 years. She had a soft voice and a gentle demeanor that made customers feel at ease. There was Frank, a retired teacher who picked up a part-time job as a cashier after leaving the classroom, always full of funny remarks. Then there was Kelly, still in high school, saving up for her first car. We were all, in our own ways, a cooperative and low-drama bunch. Before Shannon arrived, our biggest annoyance was occasionally having to clean up spills or ring up an order with an unruly coupon fanatic. We helped each other out, covered breaks when needed, and generally got along fine. Shannon, however, seemed to hate about 3/4 of us from the start, for reasons that were never clear. Maybe she believed the older staff was too slow, or resented that some of us had more experience with certain store policies. I really tried to give her the benefit of the doubt at first, thinking that perhaps she was just overwhelmed. But it soon became apparent that she genuinely disliked being around us. She'd snap at Nancy for chatting too long with a customer, even though Nancy was one of our best at fostering rapport, something our manager Grace had always encouraged. She would chastise Frank for needing a quick breather after a long line, telling him we weren't here to play games. As for Kelly, Shannon once launched into a scolding because the poor teenager had stepped away from her register to help an elderly customer load groceries into a cart. Instead of praising her for good customer service, Shannon told Kelly that she was leaving her station unattended, as if those 60 seconds were a heinous crime. The tension escalated over things like breaks and restrooms. Our company policy stipulates that, depending on the length of your shift, you get a couple of 10-minute breaks and a half-hour lunch. Shannon took it upon herself to deny these breaks for seemingly arbitrary reasons. I remember one morning when I was desperate for a quick bathroom break. I'm not a young man, and sometimes nature calls more urgently than you'd like, but Shannon insisted I wait until the rush died down. It was clear to me, however, that the rush was as calm as it would get. I suspected she was simply doing it because she could. I ended up holding it in for another half hour, an incredibly uncomfortable experience that left me irritated and more than a little resentful. I tried at first to speak to her in a calm, constructive manner about policies and ways we could all work together. I said something like, "Shannon, I know you're in a tough spot, juggling a lot of tasks. Maybe we could figure out a rotating schedule for breaks so everyone is covered without leaving the front end understaffed. She just stared at me, as if I'd suggested a radical revolution. Then she said, "That's exactly what I'm already doing. Are you questioning my competence?" Her voice was biting, and I could almost feel my stomach clench. I quickly backpedaled, trying to salvage the conversation, but she brushed past me, muttering about how older employees like to talk back. Word spread quickly among the staff about her behavior, and most of us decided, in an unspoken pact, to do the bare minimum of interacting with her. If she was near the office door and we needed something, we'd walk all the way across the store to find one of the department managers from produce, meat, or even bakery, just so we wouldn't have to ask Shannon for help. This meant that a simple question about a voided item or a stuck receipt printer could turn into a 5-minute trek across the store to locate someone, anyone, who wasn't Shannon. We all knew it was inefficient, but the morale was so bad that taking that extra step was worth avoiding her wrath. Of course, she noticed that we were circumventing her, and it enraged her even more. She'd make snarky comments like, "Don't want to ask me for help, huh? Fine, waste your time." Or if she saw me talking to the produce manager, Todd, she'd wander over and stand there, arms crossed, clearly eavesdropping, until Todd walked away looking embarrassed. But she never tried to fix the underlying issues. Instead, she just fed into a feedback loop of anger and distrust. We complained to Grace, our front-end manager, multiple times. Grace was a middle-aged woman who generally had a very calm, non-confrontational style. She'd listen earnestly, nod, tell us she understood how stressful the situation was, and promise to have a talk with Shannon. To Grace's credit, she likely did speak to Shannon privately on several occasions, but the results were non-existent. If anything, Shannon seemed to interpret these talks as a sign that we were ganging up on, and she'd return to the front end more hostile than ever. Frank once told me, after a particularly nasty interaction, "I might just retire again. I left the classroom to get away from self-centered kids, and now I have to deal with one every shift." Nancy confided in me that she often went home feeling heart palpitations from stress and had trouble sleeping because she dreaded her morning shift thanks to Shannon. Even sweet Kelly was impacted. She'd come in after school, and within half an hour, Shannon would reduce her to tears by barking orders and criticizing her scanning speed or the way she bagged items. Our store manager was named Charles, a man in his 40s who was detail-oriented about finances and inventory, but somewhat disconnected from the day-to-day interpersonal dynamics of the front end. His office was tucked away near receiving, and he spent a lot of time in meetings or analyzing sales reports. When staff members would bring issues to him, he'd listen, but often ended up redirecting them to Grace or to HR. Even when multiple complaints landed on his desk about Shannon, he seemed reluctant to step in decisively. Maybe he felt the front-end drama was beneath him, or maybe he believed it was Grace's responsibility to handle it. Either way, his inaction contributed to the sense that Shannon was invincible. We also had an HR representative, Ted, who was a soft-spoken man with glasses and a meticulously organized desk. I went to see him once about Shannon when she yelled at Kelly so fiercely that the girl had to leave her register to compose herself in the break room. I could see tears in Kelly's eyes as she walked away, and something in me snapped. I marched to Ted's office and recounted the event, providing specific quotes, times, and the effect it had on Kelly. I emphasized how Shannon's behavior was creating a hostile work environment. Ted took notes, asked clarifying questions, and promised to investigate. But after that, Shannon's behavior seemed to escalate rather than subside. I began to suspect that Ted might have confronted her in some corporate appropriate language, but she took it as a personal affront and decided to double down. As months went by, my dislike for Shannon grew into a genuine hatred, something I'd never felt for a coworker in all my years. I began to dread going to work. The sense of camaraderie we had before was replaced by a sort of survival mindset. Just get in, finish your shift, and get out without a confrontation if you could. Several times I considered requesting a transfer to another store. One day, I even updated my resume and peeked at job listings online, curious if there was a part-time gig that paid similarly but didn't involve dealing with Shannon. But I was nearing 60, and the thought of starting over somewhere else, maybe losing my seniority, my benefits, or the familiarity of the store, felt daunting. So I stuck it out, hoping something would change, or that maybe Shannon would decide to transfer again. Then came the day when Shannon had to open a register herself during a particularly hectic rush. It was a Saturday afternoon and we were slammed. Even Grace and Charles sometimes jumped on registers during those big rushes. Shannon usually tried to avoid it, perhaps seeing it as beneath her. But we were extremely short-handed that day. She chose the register right beside mine, which was unfortunate, because that put us in close proximity for several hours. Our registers were so close that we often bumped elbows if we turned too quickly. The first half hour or so passed without major incident, aside from the usual flow of customers. Then he arrived, a customer I knew all too well, a man who was perpetually rude, foul-mouthed, and seemed to take pleasure in finding ways to belittle the cashier. He was black, somewhere in his mid-30s, and always dressed sharply in business attire, but his behavior was anything but professional. I'd had him in my line several times over the years, and each time he made some snide comment, usually about how incompetent cashiers were or how store policies were designed to cheat customers. He also had a temper, prone to slamming items on the counter if he felt wronged or inconvenienced. I saw him stepping into Shannon's line instead of mine, and for the first time ever, I felt a perverse wave of relief that he wasn't coming to me. Normally, I'd dread his presence, but today, a tiny part of me was almost pleased that Shannon might have to handle him. It felt like cosmic justice. Shannon was nasty to everyone, and now she'd have to deal with one of the nastiest customers I'd ever encountered. Still, as I continued scanning groceries for my own customer, I kept an ear open in case Shannon needed backup or if things got heated. Sure enough, the man started demanding a special substitution in a promotion we were running. It was something like buy two, get one free, but he wanted to swap the free item for something that wasn't included in the promotion. Shannon, to her credit, was following company policy by refusing. She explained that the system simply wouldn't allow for the substitution. But this guy was not having it. His voice rose, calling her an idiot, telling her she didn't know how to do her job, that in other stores, they always let him have what he wanted. Shannon stayed firm, still scanning his items and explaining the policy. Then the man slammed his money on the counter, leaning across so aggressively that Shannon took a step back. He called her a very ugly word that rhymes with runt, spitting it out in pure fury, and then stomped away, leaving his groceries half-scanned. Shannon stood there in stunned silence for a moment, her face flushed. She was probably shocked that a customer had spoken to her in such a vile way. I could see how tense her jaw was. She looked at me briefly, and I looked back, my expression neutral. I can't say I felt sympathy for her, given how she'd treated all of us, but I also recognized that no one deserves to be called that. Despite everything Shannon had done, I don't believe in treating people that way. Had she been anyone else, I might have rushed over to ask if she was okay. But our relationship was so toxic that I just stayed put, continuing with my own customer. She huffed and turned back to her register, suspended his transaction, and shoved the groceries aside so the baggers could restock them. Later, I learned that the man had indeed called the customer hotline for our corporate office and lodged a formal complaint. He accused Shannon of hurling racist slurs at him, of refusing to honor the advertised sale because he was black, and of being overtly discriminatory. None of that was true. She'd simply refused to let him bend the rules of the promotion. As awful as Shannon was to us, I knew she hadn't used any racial epithets. I was standing close enough that I would have heard. She never said anything remotely like that. But the customer had spun a story that pinned the blame on Shannon and painted himself as an innocent victim. Normally, in cases like this, the manager or HR would investigate by asking for witness statements from both the employee and any coworkers who might have seen or heard the interaction. I had good standing with the company, and my word carried some weight. If I'd given a clear, decisive statement that Shannon hadn't used racist language, I have no doubt corporate would have believed. Shannon might have walked away with a slap on the wrist or no repercussions at all, because after all, company policy does not generally punish employees for following the rules about promotions. I was called into the office by Charles and Ted a couple of days after the incident. They asked me what had happened, step by step. I explained that the customer was known to be difficult and rude, and that he was trying to get something that wasn't part of the sale. Ted asked if I'd heard Shannon say anything discriminatory or racial. I took a breath. Inside, I knew logically that Shannon had not said anything racist, but I also knew how she treated every single person in that store, day in and day out, with cruelty that bordered on emotional abuse. I knew how she belittled Nancy, how she humiliated Kelly, and how she refused to allow us even the most basic courtesies. I remembered how she'd made me nearly soil myself because she refused to let me take a break to use the restroom. After all the times we'd tried to get help from management or HR, all the times we'd filed complaints, only to have nothing done, here was a chance for karma. So I avoided a direct defense. I didn't lie. I didn't say, yes, I heard Shannon call him names, but I said something along the lines of, I was pretty focused on my own line, so I didn't catch everything she said to him. I do know she can be very harsh and abrasive in how she talks to people. She tends to be nasty to many of us, so it wouldn't surprise me if the customer felt singled out. I didn't hear any specific slurs, but I can't say for sure what words were exchanged over there. Ted pressed a bit. You were standing right beside them, though, right? He asked. Our registers are quite close. Are you saying you didn't hear the conversation at all? I shook my head and shrugged. I was busy with a customer of my own, I explained. I heard them raise their voices, but I didn't catch the exact words. Shannon can be rude, and that customer can be rude too. That's all I know. Technically, that was truth. Both of them were indeed rude, but it also wasn't the full picture. I knew she hadn't used racist language. Still, I wasn't about to help her dodge the consequences. I walked away from the meeting feeling a strange mix of guilt and relief. On one hand, I'd never before withheld the truth in a way that might endanger someone's job. On the other hand, Shannon had created such a hostile environment for nearly a year that I felt, in a twisted way, she deserved some sort of reckoning. I also reasoned that if she was fired over this, it wasn't just because of a single complaint. It would likely be an accumulation of all the complaints and negative feedback that the store had received about her. This was just the trigger that might prompt corporate to finally decide enough was enough. A few days later, Shannon was gone. She didn't show up for her shift, and her name disappeared from the schedule. None of us got an official explanation. One rumor was that she'd been outright terminated after corporate decided the risk of a lawsuit wasn't worth keeping her around. Another rumor was that she quit in a rage when she found out people were throwing her under the bus. Regardless of the details, the store suddenly felt lighter, like a dark cloud had lifted. I watched Nancy practically sigh with relief when she realized Shannon was no longer looming behind the registers. Kelly smiled more during her shifts, no longer terrified of being publicly berated over a minor slip-up. Frank, who had been entertaining the idea of quitting or retiring again, decided to stay because the environment was comfortable again. Even I felt a sense of peace the following week as I scanned groceries. My shoulders felt less tense, and I didn't jump every time I saw someone coming up behind me. It was like we could finally breathe again. And yet, there was still a part of me that felt conflicted. I had spent most of my life believing that honesty and fairness in the workplace were paramount. I'd often prided myself on being that veteran employee who mentored new hires, guided them through tricky customer interactions, and helped keep the department running smooth. Shannon was the first person in my decades of experience who had made me consider bending my own moral code. In the end, I hadn't explicitly lied, but I also hadn't helped exonerate her from false allegations of racism. For a while, I'd lie awake at night replaying the meeting with Ted and Charles in my mind, wondering if I should have done things different. Should I have tried once again to go through the proper channels to say, no, she didn't call him any racist names, but here is the actual pattern of her misconduct you should be aware of. But then I'd recall how many times we'd already tried that, how many times we'd told management about her behavior, about her cruelty, only for nothing to change. This complaint from the difficult customer was the only thing that had made corporate take real action. I was also mindful that my inaction might have saved future employees at our store, maybe even at other stores in the chain if she'd gotten transferred again. From the torment we experienced, Shannon was still young, and perhaps being removed from this position would force her to confront her own issues, or at least find another line of work that didn't involve supervising people she seemed to despise. In the weeks following Shannon's departure, the atmosphere on the front end improved dramatically. Grace and Charles both seemed relieved not to have to mediate the constant stream of complaints. Our break schedules returned to normal. We could ask for help without fear of being berated or humiliated. Nancy's warm, friendly smile returned, and she often chatted with her regular customers about their kids and grandkids. Kelly regained her confidence, mastering the register and even occasionally picking up short shifts at the customer service desk for added hours. The tension that had been so palpable for nearly a year was gone. One afternoon, not long after Shannon disappeared from the schedule, Ted stopped by my register and asked how things were going. I gave him a non-committal reply that everything seemed. He nodded and then said in a low voice, "I just wanted you to know that we appreciate your cooperation during that investigation. If there's ever another issue, don't hesitate to come to me." I'm not sure if he was thanking me for handling the situation quietly or reminding me that the proper channels were always open. Either way, I gave him a polite nod and continued scanning groceries. In that moment, I felt the final pang of guilt slip away, replaced by an acceptance of what had happened. Maybe, in another timeline, Shannon would have been guided toward better management training or placed in a role that didn't involve supervising others. Maybe she would have learned empathy for older employees, recognized that not everyone can run around like a hyper-caffeinated 20-year-old, or understood that retail work is easier when you respect the people working alongside you. But that's not how things played out. In reality, she had sown so much discord that it felt like a tragedy waiting to happen. The false racism claim from the awful customer was just the last straw. For me, life at the store returned to a sort of normalcy, though it was a new normal. There was an unspoken bond formed among the cashiers who had survived the Shannon era. We'd look at one another with a mutual understanding of just how bad things had gotten, and how much of a relief it was that it was all over. Sometimes, in the break room, we'd swap stories about some of Shannon's more outlandish moments. It became a sort of cautionary tale, how a single toxic individual, wielding just a bit of authority, could unravel the morale of an entire department if management didn't act. I wondered if I'd do the same thing again, if faced with a similar situation. The answer, I think, is yes. After living through that year of stress, seeing how she made people cry and fear coming to work, I can't say I'd jump to her defense if the only way she was going to face consequences was from a trumped-up accusation by a nasty customer. Perhaps that makes me morally ambiguous, or maybe it's just the nature of self-preservation in an environment where the usual avenues for resolving disputes fail. We tried everything to get help, and no one listened until there was a threat of a discrimination lawsuit. Every so often, I still think about Shannon, wondering where she ended up. Maybe she found a different job in a different retail chain. Maybe she went back to school, or maybe she tried to file a lawsuit or complaint of her own. But I haven't heard anything, and I doubt I ever will. All I know is that I didn't do anything to stop her from being fired or from quitting. I let fate run its course. Deep down, I believe that it was the only thing that finally set the store free from her toxic grip. So, that's my confession in a way. I could have prevented her termination, but I didn't. I just stood by, gave non-committal answers, and let the chips fall where they may. Does that make me a bad person? Some might think so, but if you'd seen the tears on Nancy's cheeks, or the trembling in Kelly's voice, or the drawn, anxious look on Frank's face after Shannon's tirades, you might understand why I let the system work against her when I had the chance. She had made life miserable for too many people for too long, and the universe, in its own twisted logic, found a way to remove her. Now, when I come to work, I no longer feel that dread gnawing at my stomach. I greet my customers, scan their items, ask about their days, and share little jokes with the kids who pass by. Occasionally, we get a new face in the store, be it a cashier or a customer service rep, but none of them have come close to replicating Shannon's reign of terror. I'm not naive. This is still retail, and there will always be challenging personalities and difficult customers. But for now, at least, the air feels cleaner, lighter, and everyone seems to get along better. That's enough for me. I'm not proud of how it ended, but I'm also not sorry. Sometimes a person's behavior is so egregious that you find yourself simply stepping aside and letting them march into their own downfall. That's precisely what Shannon did, and if I, by inaction, helped expedite that process, then so be it. Life goes on, the store continues, and the rest of us can finally do our jobs without fear. I'll just keep scanning groceries, punching the clock, and making small talk about the weather. Grateful that Shannon is nothing more than a memory now. In the end, maybe that's all any of us can do. Try to find some peace even if it arrives in a messy, complicated way.